told that the Renaissance was a rebirth of ancient knowledge, a time when Europe rediscovered Greek and Roman wisdom after centuries of darkness. But what if it wasn't a rebirth at all? What if the so called ancient world was actually created or heavily edited during the Renaissance and medieval era itself? There were way too many suspicious overlaps in historical record. Plato was said to be the father of Platonism, and then centuries later, a man named Plotinus appears, reviving Plato's teachings. And then after that, we get Gemistoplephon, same philosophy, nearly the same name, and suddenly Plato's lost manuscripts are discovered at the same time. Feels a little too perfect. Same with Dionysius. One Dionysius calculated the date of Easter in the 3rd century, another Dionysius 3 centuries later, also calculates Easter and also follows a bishop named Victor. Are they two different people, or was the story duplicated and spaced out across time? There's also Irenaeus Modestinus, a Roman law expert who supposedly dies in 244 AD. Roman law then disappears 900 years and suddenly gets revived in 1088 by Anarius, a man doing the exact same thing with nearly the exact same name. That is not a coincidence, that is a pattern. Even Homer shows up twice. There's the famous ancient Greek poet, and then there's Angilbert Homer, a medieval poet in the court of Charlemagne. Historians say his name was just a nickname, but why are there so many poetic doppelgangers? And speaking of Charlemagne, that name literally just means the great king. It may not have even referred to a specific person. Many kings could have been called that. When we look at medieval artwork, we start seeing ancient stories dressed in medieval clothing. There are literal tapestries of the fall of Troy where everyone is wearing 15th century knight armor. Medieval people didn't treat stories like Troy and the Odyssey as ancient, they saw them as their own history. The French even believed they were descended from the Trojans. In some texts, the character Paris, who stole Helen, is referred to as Paris, the same word used for the city of Paris. These aren't just stories from the distant past. They were active myths that people in the Middle Ages claimed as their own. Many famous works of philosophy were also lost for over 1,000 years and then magically reappeared in the Renaissance. Like, hey, people were not debating Plato and Aristotle in medieval Europe until the 1200s. Then suddenly their works are everywhere. It's almost like they weren't discovered, they were introduced. The earliest full biography of Aristotle doesn't even show up until 1300s, and some of his best Greek manuscripts only date back to the 10th or 12th century, not exactly ancient. You'd expect handwritten books to disappear after the printing press, but in places like Greek and the Balkans, people kept handwriting books well into the 1800s. That means many of the manuscripts called ancient today could actually be recent copies or even first drafts written during the time of printing. In fact, Renaissance humanists and rich collectors ordered handwritten books of ancient texts to display their love of old knowledge. These weren't always ancient artifacts, they were luxury items. So the majority of the ancient manuscripts we know today just so happened to be found during the Renaissance. Yes, in small towns and private libraries across Europe, at a time when the church, scholars, and royals were obsessed with reviving classical knowledge. All the ancient Greek texts were reintroduced to Europe by Byzantine scholars fleeing to Italy in the 1400s, but almost every Greek manuscript we rely on today is actually a Byzantine copy made 500 to 1,500 years after the original authors lived. We're still using the copies of that mysterious manuscript, and no one alive today has ever seen the original. So, where were these texts hiding for over 1,000 years during the so called Dark Ages?